But what if he had recovered? What if the fever broke, and the world was granted not an end, but an intermission? What if history got 10 more years of Alexander's singular, world-altering ambition? His grandest designs were still just whispers and plans. Preparations were already underway for an expedition into the Arabian Peninsula. And beyond that, ancient writers like Diodorus tell us he had his eyes on the unconquered. West, the powerful merchant empire of Carthage, and the rising Roman Republic. The next decade of his life wouldn't have been about resting on his laurels, but a fresh explosion of conquest and cultural engineering so profound it could have completely rewritten the destiny of the ancient world. This is the story of the world that might have been. In 323 BC, in the heart of Babylon, the world held its breath. Alexander the Great, at just 32 years old, lay dying from a sudden, violent fever. His body was ravaged by a decade of non-stop campaigning, and his massive empire, stretching from Greece to India, was held together by nothing more than the sheer force of his will. Historically, this is where his story ends. His death plunged his vast territory into chaos, as the very generals who helped him build it immediately began to tear it apart in what became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, a great recovery and the silencing of dissent. Our story diverges in that stifling Babylonian palace. The crisis passes, and a weakened but very much alive Alexander slowly regains his strength. News of his survival would have spread like wildfire, bringing immense relief to his loyal veterans. But for his highest-ranking generals, the ambitious men who would historically become the Diadochi, or successors, it would have been a quiet disappointment. The ultimate prize was snatched away. Politically, a near-death experience would have made Alexander sharper than ever. It would have shown him the single greatest threat to his empire, his own mortality. He had no clear, adult heir, and his kingdom was a patchwork of conquered peoples, held in check by a Macedonian elite whose loyalty was starting to wear thin. So the first couple of years of this new decade wouldn't be for a new war, but for a ruthless consolidation of power. He'd seen the vultures circling, and now it was time to clip their wings. This would likely have involved a political purge. Ambitious generals might have been recalled, reassigned to forgotten outposts, or given cushy, ceremonial jobs in Babylon where he could keep an eye on them. In their place, he'd likely elevate younger officers, men whose careers were tied directly to him, not to the old Macedonian aristocracy. At the same time, he'd have to address the grievances of his army. These were the men who had mutinied at the Hyphasis River, exhausted and refusing to march further into India. A chastened Alexander would understand their morale was critical. He'd pay them generously from Persian treasuries and grant his veterans land. He would also likely accelerate a program he'd already started, the training of 30,000 Persian youths in the Macedonian style of warfare, known as the Epigoni. These troops, loyal to Alexander himself rather than to Macedon, could relieve his long-serving veterans, allowing tens of thousands to finally go home with stories of their invincible king. This would have been a masterstroke, solving his manpower problem while beginning the true fusion of his empire's military. And what about succession? His wife, Roxana, had a son, Alexander IV. Historically, the boy was murdered before he could rule. But with a living, breathing god-king for a father, he becomes the focal point of a new dynasty. Alexander would have begun the boy's formal education, perhaps even trying to bring back his old tutor, Aristotle, and presented him to the empire as the undisputed heir, ending any dangerous ambiguity about the future. The Arabian campaign. Masters of the incense roads with his power secure and his army revitalized, a 35-year-old Alexander would likely turn to his first unfinished project, Arabia. This wasn't a whim. At the time of his death, preparations were already being made. Reconnaissance missions had been sent, and a large fleet was under construction. Why Arabia? First, strategy. The Arabian Peninsula was a huge unconquered territory on his southern flank. Securing it would connect Egypt and Persia, creating a solid southern frontier. Second, money. The Arabs controlled the incredibly wealthy incense trade routes, and controlling that trade would fill his treasuries for generations. And third, a reason perfectly suited to Alexander's ego. The Arab tribes hadn't sent ambassadors to him. They hadn't acknowledged his greatness. For a man who saw himself as a living god, that was an insult he couldn't ignore. The campaign, probably kicking off around 320 BC, would be a classic Alexander combined arms operation. His new fleet, under his admiral Nearchus, would sail from the Persian Gulf to subdue the coastal cities. Meanwhile, Alexander would lead a land army, now much better prepared for desert warfare, after learning hard lessons in the Jadrosian desert. It wouldn't be easy, but the outcome would hardly be in doubt. The wealthy but disunited coastal cities would likely fall one by one. The inland tribes, unused to facing a disciplined, professional army, would be subdued through a mix of force and diplomacy. Alexander would almost certainly establish a series of new Alexandrias along the coast-fortified cities to act as garrisons and trade hubs. By 318 BC, the Arabian Peninsula could have been his. The incense trade would flow into his treasury, and the Red Sea and Persian Gulf would effectively become Macedonian lakes. This would have brought Hellenistic culture into the Arabian Peninsula centuries before the rise of Islam, potentially altering the region's development in ways that are hard to even imagine. Alexander's ambition was a force of nature, reshaping maps and destinies. And just as he sought to conquer the known world, we're on a quest to explore the greatest what-ifs of history. If you're fascinated by this journey into the world that could have been, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you won't miss our next expedition into alternate history. The Western War. Alexander versus Carthage. With the south secured, a nearly 40-year-old Alexander would face a big choice. Go back east to finish what he started in India, or turn west toward the great power of Carthage. Some ancient sources, like the historian Diodorus, suggest Alexander had ambitions of conquering the entire Mediterranean coast, all the way to the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It makes strategic sense. Carthage was a naval superpower controlling the western Mediterranean. To Alexander, now the champion of Hellenism, a clash with the descendants of their ancient Phoenician rivals was almost an ideological necessity. The Mediterranean simply wasn't big enough for two masters. This war would likely have started around 317 BC, not with a direct assault on the famously well-defended city of Carthage, but by dismantling its empire piece by piece. Alexander would probably strike first at Sicily, a long-contested battleground between Greeks and Carthaginians. From there, he could launch campaigns into North Africa and Iberia, using his classic divide-and-conquer strategy. And this is where another player enters the scene, Rome. In 317 BC, the Roman Republic was a tough regional power in central Italy. How would it react to the world's greatest conqueror on its doorstep? A cautious Alexander might have offered a treaty, recognizing Roman dominance in Italy in exchange for an alliance against Carthage. The Roman historian Livy famously speculated that Rome would have beaten Alexander, but that's likely a bit of patriotic wishful thinking. The Roman army of that era wasn't the professional juggernaut it would later become, and it had never faced a commander with Alexander's genius. An alliance, or even becoming a junior Parker in a Hellenistic world, seems like a more probable outcome for Rome, cutting its path to empire short. The war against Carthage would have been long and brutal, likely ending with a massive siege of the great city itself. But with the resources of his entire empire behind him, it's a siege Alexander likely would have won. By 315 BC, he could have been the undisputed master on the Mediterranean, the final frontier, a return to India. Would that have been enough for him? Probably not. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in India was a deep wound to his pride. He had been forced to turn back, leaving his dream of reaching the ends of the world unfulfilled. For a man like Alexander, that was an obsession. So, as he neared 40, the pull of the East would be irresistible. A final great campaign would likely begin around 314 BC. This time, he wouldn't be leading a weary army. He'd march with his elite veterans, supplemented by his Persian epigoni and fresh troops from his new western territories. He would march back through Persia and into the Indus Valley with a force even larger than his first. This time, there would be no stopping at the Hyphasis. He would advance into the Gangetic Plain, the heartland of the powerful Nanda Empire. Greek sources claimed the Nanda army was massive, a prospect that had terrified his men before. But sheer numbers had never stopped Alexander. The ensuing battles would have been epic, but his tactical genius would likely have prevailed, just as it had against the Persians at Gaugamela. Conquering the Nanda Empire would bring him to the shores of the Bay of Bengal, finally reaching the great outer sea. This would have created a cultural fusion on an unprecedented scale. Greco-Buddhism, which did emerge in our timeline, might have developed far earlier and more profoundly, with its influence spreading across Southeast Asia. Greek ideas would flow east, and Indian philosophy would flow west, transforming both worlds. A new world order, the empire at age 42. By 313 BC, at age 42, Alexander would stand astride the world. His empire would stretch from Spain to Bengal, a truly global state. These 10 extra years would have allowed him to move beyond conquest and begin the work of building a civilization. His policy of cultural fusion would have been implemented on a massive scale, encouraging intermarriage and building dozens of new multicultural cities, New Alexandrias, from Iberia to India. Koine Greek would have likely become the lingua franca of government and commerce from Spain to India, cementing a shared identity across his domain. Religious syncretism would accelerate, with Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian deities merging into a vibrant universal pantheon. Most importantly, the empire would have had a chance at stability. The bloody wars of the Diadochi, which tore his empire apart, might have been avoided. With Alexander alive, his generals would have remained his subordinates. He would have had a decade to build a durable administrative structure, and his son, Alexander IV, would now be a teenager, groomed to inherit a stable, unified, and truly global empire. If Alexander had lived those 10 extra years, the world we know might be unrecognizable. The rise of Rome could have been stifled. The deep cultural and political divide between East and West might have been blurred into a single interconnected civilization. His consolidated empire, with a clear line of succession, would have had a much greater chance of surviving his eventual death. We might not speak of a Roman legacy, but an Alexandrian one, defined not by the gravitas of Rome, but by the dynamic, expansionist, and culturally fused vision of a single man. Of course, we can never know for certain. The internal pressures of such a vast empire might still have torn it apart. But for one shining decade, Alexander would have been the undisputed master of a world he remade in his own image. What do you think would have been the most significant change? Could this empire have truly held together after his eventual death? Or was it always destined to collapse? Let me know your theories in the comments below.